So I'm really happy to be able to have a chat with my friend and colleague, longtime friend and colleague for over 30 years, Deborah Brown, who's the Professor of Philosophy at the University of Queensland. And she's been in that position since 2018, I believe, but at University of Queensland for much, much longer. In fact, the core of her career. And she's got a really interesting kind of background and has done work in a bunch of different areas that I want to just highlight before we open up the conversation. So just to give the sort of, bare bones, I guess start with a professional sort of background. Deb specializes in the history of early modern philosophy. That's one of her main areas, and especially on Descartes. And she's done 2 books on Descartes, 2006, The Passionate Mind with Cambridge, and more recently in 2019, Descartes and the Ontology of Everyday Life with Oxford. So they're major sorts of research accomplishments in that area, but she's written more broadly on women in the history of modern philosophy, on Hobbes, a little bit on Locke, around that period that runs roughly, and I'll probably get corrected on this, and I'm entirely open to being schooled, roughly, 1620 to about 1800 or so in the early 19th century. It's a very important period in the history of philosophy, and Deb's done important work on major figures there. She's also done work, the way I think about it, as sort of bookending the main contributions on the history of modern philosophy in my own area, philosophy of mind and language. And we sort of started out, and that's how we met, actually, in a conference session that was dedicated to the philosophy of mind, where there's a lot of focus on individualism and externalism, how we understand mental representation. And that's work that Deb was focused on very much in the first 5+ years of her career. It's probably never really gone away. And there's some recent work on that as well in the philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, metaphysics and epistemology more generally. And the other major area that she's made, I think some of the most important contributions to that sometimes get missed by people in academic philosophy, but they're especially important here, is associated with her work on the Critical Thinking Project. And we will talk about that at the University of Queensland and the way in which it really facilitates that next generation of philosophers, not philosophers, of whom you are a major component. And that project has been really, really significant nationally, I think even internationally, in opening up the boundaries of philosophy and empowering people to engage in philosophical thinking from a real diversity of backgrounds. So we'll get on to talk a little bit about that. So Deb was an undergraduate at the University of Queensland and has a first-class honours degree in philosophy from probably 86, 87, Deb? Somewhere
86.
86. And then went on a prestigious Commonwealth scholarship to go to the University of Toronto, where she completed her master's and her PhD in the early 1990s. I want to say 92. Do you reckon? Okay, yeah. That seems like a good year. All right. So that's the bare bones biography, but we're going to unfold this a little bit more informally through conversation and talk about some of these things as we go. So one of the things that I find really interesting is just kind of, hearing a little bit about how people got started on that philosophy path, because it's not a default path for everybody. And was it for you, Deb, or how did you get into philosophy? What happened?
Oh, well, gosh, I had a very circuitous route. So certainly it was not discussed around my dinner table when I was growing up as a kid. My parents were very much working class people. In fact, neither of them had more than a middle school education in England. They were both out working at the age of 13, had been evacuated during the war and things like that, so had all their schooling interrupted for long periods of time. And then they moved to Australia in the 50s. And so, my household did not have all of those indicators of academic success that people talk about nowadays, like, numbers of books and, academic conversations and, level of education of the parents and so on. But what there was a lot of was a lot of humour, a lot of teasing, which made for us kids being very resilient. We got used to being challenged a lot, and we're very comfortable with that. And I think that humour and philosophy are very closely connected. And so it's not surprising that eventually I went into philosophy. But after school, I went to TAFE, and even that was considered rather poncy in my family. Why aren't you out getting a job? There was lots of conversations about that. And then it was at TAFE that I was starting to do some humanities subjects, as well as I was in a commercial design program, and we all had to take some humanities subjects. And it was there that I got exposed actually to some political science and some sociology. And somebody there said to me, why don't you go to university? And I think I literally said, what's that? I was so clueless. And that person said, you can do sociology, politics, even take a philosophy course. And that was the first time that, that I'd ever heard of this term philosophy. And then once I was at university, I did take one philosophy course, and I was also taking a lot of politics and sociology. And I realized that the philosophers were asking the foundational questions, the fundamental questions, that there really was no point in trying to measure things like oppression or inequality, or trying to have views about what justice and fairness would look like politically and socially, without first understanding what those concepts meant and what the phenomena were that we were trying to actually discover. So I was drawn back more into those foundational philosophical questions, good old-fashioned ones like what is justice, what is fairness, what's equality, what's oppression, and so on. And that's how I ended up being drawn into philosophy. And then I realised that it was a lot of fun, and fun is good, as Dr. Seuss says.
Fun is good, yeah. And there's that connection back to humour, which we'll also circle back to. And as you've been chatting, I just dropped a few links for students to have a look at, including a very important link, I think, not to be underestimated, to the underrated publication, Cane Toad Times, which I believe you were involved in the production of. So if students eventually click on that, they'll actually go and see one of the issues, which is now of historical significance in the UQ archive, I believe. But can you tell us a bit about that as you stepped up into this interface of philosophy, humour, and student life in politics at UQ?
Right. So when I went to university, then I had done a lot of cartoons as part of my training in TAFE in Queensland. It was the Queensland College of Art, and I thought it'd been a waste of time if I couldn't get them published somewhere. So I fronted up to the student magazine, and I did some work for Semper, at the time, which was the student magazine at UQ. And then the group of people who were editing Semper then created this magazine called the Cane Toad Times, which was at the time Australia's only humour magazine. And so we branded ourselves thus and so. But we really had, and we were a kind of counterculture humour collective. And our target was the very conservative and corrupt government in Queensland at the time, and corruption within the police force. And we had Reggie Didge journalists working with us, and a whole bunch of artists and animators and cartoonists from around Queensland, and also some from other states as well. And we ended up feeding a fair bit of the information we collected in that period to the Four Corners report, which prompted the Fitzgerald inquiry back in the day. So we were not just raising consciousness about the corruption and the political morass in Queensland at the time. We also were politically active. But I think that our mantra was essentially that before you storm the barricades, you need a good dose of ridicule. And ridicule, or humour, taking a humorous approach, is a really great way to break down the barriers to people's ability to change their mind about a topic. If you can show people the absurdity of a certain line of thinking, then that can have a greater impact than just sort of, the blunt force trauma of trying to change somebody's political directions or political assumptions. So that was the purpose of the magazine. And then it went from about, would have been about 1987 or 88, all the way through to Wayne Goss's government in the, so that would, not 87, it was much earlier than that. It would have been 83, all the way through to about 89 when Wayne Goss took over the premiership in Queensland, and we all had to get real jobs. But as you say, now it's at the archives both at UQ and also at the State Library of Queensland, and there was a big exhibition in 2011, which just reinforced in my mind that I'm history.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, students who are interested in following through on that part of things can actually go and pick out at least 2 sets of cartoons that you have in that issue that's they can get to directly from the link, and seems very contemporary to me. And what I'm interested in is the way in which you see, you've already touched on it, but humour's mediating. It's helping us change our minds. It's challenging assumptions. It's breaking down people's maybe political stasis or other ways in which they're stuck on things. So is that how you see the main sort of philosophical kind of connection as well, or with humour and these other kinds of activities, or is it something else?
Oh, I think formally there's a lot in common between humour and philosophy. I mean, if you think about the reductio argument, the form of argument called reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to absurdity, you can see, structurally that works very similar to a good joke which sort of, you're going down a line of thinking and then suddenly there's this incongruity, and it makes you realize, the suppositions or assumptions that you start with, and makes you question them. So I think that structurally you can see a lot of similarity between good forms of humor. Obviously, slapstick doesn't have a lot of that kind of logical structure to it, in my humble opinion, but I could be shown wrong. And also just good forms of argument. But I think it's also that effective engagement as well. Willingness to have your mind changed, and also the willingness to explore new ways of thinking. So I think effectively and also logically, there's a lot of similarity between humour and philosophy. And I used to joke that the way I did philosophy was I figured out what punchline I wanted to make and then reasoned backwards. It hasn't always proved to be easy, but it certainly.
No, that's really interesting. So you'd be probably a fan of the idea of stand-up philosophy, for example, which is such a thing, right? As you know, probably there are some philosophers in terms of community engagement and getting people effectively involved, and using those kind of emotional hooks in some ways, not in an evil way, not in a manipulative way, but to sort of do more than grab attention, but to actually get people to take something more seriously than they might not have. So to take the unserious to bring out the serious aspects, because there are serious issues, like in the background you were talking about the conservativeness of the government and the corruptness of the government that was in place, and that was a way to call attention to that, to get a hook in that.
The history of philosophy is riddled with good jokes and bad jokes, and I think it's often the measure of a philosopher how good their jokes are. And one of my favourite examples is actually from Sextus Empiricus, the ancient skeptic, right? Who records this wonderful story. So at the time, sophistry was rife, and the sophists would use philosophical arguments to score points, and without enough concern for the truth. And so the skeptics were not being skeptics just for the sake of being skeptics, but they had as their targets these sophists who they think abused philosophical methods and ways of thinking. And there's this lovely example that Sextus records of Diodorus Cronus, who argued that there was no such thing as motion, because either everything is where it is or is where it's not, but nothing is where it's not, so it must be where it is. But if it is where it is, then nothing is moved. And Sextus said, Diodorus then dislocated his shoulder and took himself off to the physician Herophilus, who then argued, either your shoulder is where it is or is where it's not, but nothing can be where it's not. So therefore, your shoulder hasn't moved, and so it isn't dislocated. That'll be 20 drachma, please. And at that point, Diodorus, screams, fix it, fix my shoulder. And I think it's that incongruity between, your philosophical views have to be put to the test of experience. You have to be able to live by your philosophical views. or they aren't worth a tin of beans. And I think that was a really lovely way of demonstrating the importance of making one's philosophy true, not just to yourself, but also to the world in which you live. It kind of keeps us humble.
Right, interesting. Yeah, I was having a look just the other day at Robert Nozick's philosophical explanations from, now it's 40 years old. And I was reminded, I just want to see the full context of the idea that, we want these kind of, we talk about these knockout arguments and just overpowering people. We use these coercive metaphors to describe philosophical engagement. And I wonder what you thought about that, because Nozick's obviously calling attention to that, I think partly critically, that made me think when I read it more about, well, what was your philosophical environment like at Harvard when you were there? It was probably pretty brutal from the sounds of it, and, so his alternative is to think about what we really want to do is engage in philosophical explanations rather than philosophical arguments that push people down a path. Is that your view, or do you think we just need a broader conception of argumentation that appeals to more than some narrow notion of reason that pulls people over or grabs people, that persuades them?
Yeah, no, I really resonate with those kinds of comments. I mean, my undergraduate training in philosophy, I used to joke that it was, philosophy as a combat sport in the early days. And I remember actually being quite turned off with philosophy of mind. So, so there we were, you and I both were doing philosophy of mind at roughly the same time. And it's something that actually drew me to the history of philosophy. Was that philosophy of mind was just getting to be very combative and very competitive, and it wasn't producing good outcomes. It was rather, in fact, polarizing the field, and I thought was actually impeding new ideas from having a room on the table, getting published, and so on. And I like the fact that in the history of philosophy, there was much more sort of openness and acceptance of different, ways of thinking philosophically. And I think a lot has changed. I think that the classrooms that I'm seeing nowadays are much more open than they were even in the days when I changed. And I think that's a good thing, because in terms of training people philosophically, the most important thing is giving people that experience and that practice of occupying different perspectives. I mean, I think for a long time, philosophy kind of lost the importance and the centrality of the principle of charity in philosophical thinking. Without the principle of charity, we're more likely to engage in straw man reasoning, to think, to accuse our opponents of holding views they don't really hold, and to not really exercise those charitable ways of thinking. So I think the most important thing in philosophy classrooms, whether it be in school or at university level, is to just keep that sense that these issues have been around for a long time. There's always more to be said. As Richard Rorty said, there's always room for words other than last words. And I think that's another important thing we need to keep in mind as educators. And that the important thing at the end of the day is just being able to get students inducted into the dialectic of philosophy, the give and take of reasons, rather than actually pushing any particular agenda on a given issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about that both about these undergraduate years, and I'm interested in the influences you had. You already mentioned this idea of philosophy as a combat sport, as kind of directing you from one area to another. That took you a little bit of time to make that transition complete, it seems, but I'm still
back there now, so
yeah, right. But I'm also interested in the work and the history of modern philosophy and the space there as well that you found, and thinking about people whom you're a real authority on, like Descartes, and the role of passions and emotions in Descartes, because there's a certain kind of conception I think that people have of Descartes, associating him entirely with I think, therefore I am, and this sort of reconstructing the world from scratch. But we can go with either of those first. Do you want to say a little bit, I mean, it's up to you, but more about the influences at the undergraduate sort of level, or about Descartes and history of modern?
Oh, well, I had a fantastic experience as a student, which will, never be repeated, I think, in the history of universities. it was much more like a guild system than, you know, a sort of mass education model. So I had the privilege of sitting in these classes with these really phenomenal minds at the University of Queensland as an undergraduate. And there would just be 7 people there. And then we would all, you know, go hang out in the tea room after class, and somebody would walk in and put up a problem on there was a chalkboard in the tea room. We sit around drinking cups of tea and we'd work on problems. So it was sort of philosophy in and out of the classroom. And my teachers were very much, they felt like friends. And in fact, we would do things, we would have parties, and it was very social as well. And it's a luxury that is hard to replicate in a university which has got 65,000 students, right? But it was an extraordinary experience, and there were key figures like Marion Tapper. I think Marion Tapper was the one who got me into philosophy. She was just such an extraordinary thinker and teacher, and again combined all of those intellectual virtues with all the effective importance of relationships as well, right? So the need to kind of connect and trust between interlocutors she ran her classes like a community of inquiry, exactly what we're trying to model here in the Philosothon. So she was a huge influence, as were people like Andre Galois, who really constantly challenged my thinking and made me tough. He really did make me, get a thick skin. But he was an incredible mind, as were Ian Hinkfuss and Rod Girl and others there as well. So I had a really wonderful undergraduate experience. So that's that for that. Well, and so
we'll come back to Gay. I mean, I'll follow up on that a little bit more, because I want to ask Marion Tapper is, I think, still now in WA, or she was recently. I haven't seen her for the last few months, and that's an interesting connection, I think, between the places, because one of the things that I'm thinking of, although it's based just on one example, is thinking about the role of women in philosophy in the 1980s, 1990s, even today. Is it just a coincidence that it happened? I mean, you mentioned other people as well, like Andre, but Marion was the one you singled out. Is maybe not, that's the wrong question to ask, is it coincidental? But what would you say about this sort of status of women in philosophy in a profession that's still very much male dominated by many different sorts of measures?
Yeah, I would say it's a lot better. And interestingly, I think Marion would have been the first full-time appointment at the University of Queensland, female appointment at the University of Queensland.
In philosophy? In
philosophy. I'm pretty sure that's true. And when I went to Toronto, there were only 4% of the faculty there who were women. And this, people sort of worry about or wonder about the importance of role models, but they're absolutely critical, I think. I think you need somebody that you can identify with, and who also understands, where you might be coming from. And so I had the same. I found the culture at Toronto, again, it was very welcoming, and I had a very good time, and learned an incredible amount. But when I finished my PhD, I spent a year teaching at Toronto, and it was very difficult. I found that the male students in particular were very aggressive towards me, and I attribute it to the fact that there just wasn't enough representation of women in the philosophy department there. Because my next job was at York University, where there were 25% women on the faculty there, and the culture was radically different. There was a lot more respect for women lecturers in philosophy at the time, and I think the numbers, just made all the difference in the world. And plus, there were also strong women there as well. So now departments are much more conscious of trying to achieve a gender balance, but I think we still have a long way to go in the profession. So all you young women there in the audience, come up through the ranks. We need you.
Yeah, for sure. And I was also interested in other aspects of diversity in philosophy as well. And this will take me actually straight into talking about having you talk about the critical thinking project, I think, as well, because to me, that's been one of the great broader diversifiers in the little toolbox that I think you've developed over the last 10 plus years at UQ. So maybe we could use that segue into as an opportunity to start talking about that, and then we'll come back and talk a bit more about history of modern.
Okay. So the Critical Thinking Project at the University of Queensland, it's really largely a teaching for thinking project. So one of the things that we want to do is to get more philosophy and critical thinking into the schools. There is a philosophy and reason subject, which is a senior subject in Queensland schools. It's been adopted by about 30 schools, and a lot of the schools are actually recognising the value of that course, not just in terms of improving students' academic performance, which it certainly does, and there's lots of data on that, but also on its building these virtues of good inquirers. So resilience, open-mindedness, and really virtues that are important to citizenship as well. So a lot of schools that have introduced philosophy and reason as a senior subject have now pushed it back and now offering it all the way through to grade 7. So that's been a hugely important thing. The other thing we started to do was to work with the Queensland Government Department of Education's Impact Centre, at which Cara is employed, to develop critical thinking courses to be delivered online to students all over the state of Queensland. And we've had over 350 schools participate in that critical thinking series, with students from as young as grades 4 all the way through to grade 10. And again, the data on that is there, in terms of students' educational gains, their improved performance on NAPLAN and also on the A to E data is quite clear that that's a real game changer for a lot of students. And the fact that it's available to students all over Queensland, including very remote communities, so communities way up in the Torres Strait, are, Tagai College, students there doing their critical thinking. I love this image of students on Saibai, which is a little island from which you can walk to Papua New Guinea at low tide, with their headphones on, learning critical thinking from a UQ Impact Centre developed course. I love that idea. I love the fact that this, group of 8 prestigious university in Brisbane can be outreaching these very remote communities. And we also worked with the Department of Education to develop a program specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, which is called Solid Pathways, which is still going strong. Again, students learning all about critical thinking and applying it to different areas of the curriculum. And that course, that program, which has about 500 to 800 students in it in any given year, is a real game changer, and has really kind of kept a lot of those students on track to any career that they might be interested in. And that, those kinds of areas, particularly, engaging more Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander students in philosophy is one of our goals in our project. And we also develop courses for low SES students. And again, the data on that is pretty impressive. We're seeing higher retention and completion rates and higher GPAs, actually higher GPAs than the university average changer. It's because it's empowering. I think it's empowering to give students a voice, give them the opportunity to express their voice, and also to give them the tools to develop a reasoned position and articulate it well. I mean, those skills are absolutely important academically, socially, and in every other way. But the point I was going to make about the course that we have for low SES and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students is what, in terms of students' results once they transition to UQ, it's showing not only does it help create a level playing field, it actually boosts performance relative to the average at UQ. So it's actually helping these students to perform better than the average. So we're really very proud of all that. And finally, the other work we do is around what we call a teaching for thinking pedagogy, which has been developed by my very clever colleague, Dr. Peter Ellerton, and Cara is one of our facilitators. in that project too. So we're also working with schools to kind of embed philosophy and critical thinking across the curriculum, not just in terms of standalone courses.
Yeah, so I'm really interested to follow up on how you think this kind of works. I have a question about that. So what I want to do is I want to follow up on exactly this. Like the basic question is, yep, I'm completely on board, of course, with all of this diversifying of philosophy and equipping, the next generation of minds with as much sort of, in some sense, firepower and equipment they need for all walks of life. And it looks like philosophy is doing that. And I'm kind of curious, why does philosophy do that, or how does it do it? Like, I mean, you sort of, and this might bring us back to talk about effectiveness and emotions in philosophy. And I have certain kinds of views. I have a dog in this fight, I guess, but I'm curious, how you think it works. Is it just that people learn rules for thinking and they apply them, or what else goes on with that process?
Right. I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I think that what we have to do is, I've spent a lot of time, looking at cognitive biases that psychologists talk a lot about, and one of the most pernicious kinds of biases is belief perseverance, right? This kind of inertia that we have, and there are these wonderful, bizarre experiments that they do, which just show how deeply entrenched our prior beliefs can be. So for example, when we're challenged, we're more, our beliefs are more likely to become more entrenched rather than less. And then just all the ways in which our thinking is framed, right? The more we hear something, the more often we hear something, the more likely we are to believe it, right? And then there's kind of gazillion of these, cognitive biases that we're prone to. And a lot of education, insofar as it's been focused on the importance of having critical thinking in the classroom, has tended to focus on these, logical rules or tips and tricks. Like if you just teach students the fallacies, then they'll be able to transfer that, across, various domains of their learning across the curriculum and so on. And it just doesn't work like that. What we have to also include a value dimension, right? So we have to engage students in, they have to not only sort of, in a sense, be able to apply these rules and, detect validity and question the truth of premises and so on. They need to do that in a way that's aligned to what we call in our project values of inquiry. Right. So, so can you perform an analysis with respect to clarity, depth, breadth, precision, relevance, accuracy, cogency, and when you get students sort of performing these cognitive tasks like analysis, inference, justification, evaluation, synthesis, whatever it might be, when you get them doing that with a view, in a way that directs them to these values of inquiry, then they're able to reflect on the quality of their own thinking and that of others. So then it becomes this normative exercise around, what does quality thinking look like, right? How can I make my thinking clearer, right? I've got this, is my evidence relevant? Well, if it's relevant, but is it significant? And you start to get students playing with these values of inquiry. And when you're in that space, then they can start to develop what we call these virtues of inquiry, things like open-mindedness, resilience, integrity, persistence. They can use the principle of charity. And that's really taking it beyond this sort of purely intellectual application of rules. And in fact, we know also from psychological studies that if you teach any domain, any domain of inquiry, any discipline in a very procedural way, then students will get hung up on the procedures, on the formulae, and in a way that will actually conflict with their producing the best outcome. So there are these classic examples where even people with PhDs were given a formula and told to measure the volume of a sphere. And so they, applied the formula, they got a result and so on. And when they were then sort of asked to sort of pour water into the sphere and then pour it out again into a measuring device, and the measurement they got conflicted with what they got from the formula. And that all but one of these, subjects in this one particular study I was looking at, stuck with the formula, right? Only one of them said, they prefer to go with their actual measurement, and this is a bit like the example that Sextus is talking about in the case of Diodorus Cronus, sort of sticking to his theory, despite the fact that, it's not going to get his shoulder relocated, right? So we can get overly attached to rules and formulae and sort of lose in a sense the point of those kinds of rules. And, you just get this uncritical acceptance of these things. And we need to always be critically questioning. And that's true even, as we know, in logic as well.
Yeah, interesting. I do want to switch over to get back to Descartes. There's always this commentary note about that. And I wanted to ask you maybe to start off, but you can go in a different direction if you think it's more profitable, why Descartes? You've done 2 books on Descartes now. There's lots of other guys in that pantheon to look at, and there's lots of women to look at as well, right? So why Descartes? Why does he sort of stand out? What's grabbed you about him?
Well, what's interesting is when I first segued into the history of philosophy, I actually started off in medieval philosophy. I've written a few papers on William of Ockham and also Thomas Aquinas. And Descartes is, I think of as this transitional figure. So first of all, Descartes is historically incredibly important for contemporary philosophy because many contemporary philosophical problems can be traced back to Descartes, and also the way in which we do philosophy, the philosophical method. It's very unlike anything that you would find in the medieval period. So he really is a transitional figure, methodologically, and also in terms of the kinds of issues that he raised. And also, oddly enough, given my background and training, he was a bit of an underdog, right? So, and I was sort of raised to think of Descartes as a somewhat dodgy figure in the history of philosophy who had separated the mind and body, and insofar as women get aligned with the body and men get aligned with the mind, Descartes is the root of all our feminist evils. And I guess one of the reasons why I very much got interested in working on Descartes was I came to see that was largely a caricature of this view. And in fact, he's got an incredibly rich account of the integration of mental and bodily functions. It may all seem very quaint to us nowadays, but he's trying to work out essentially what we might think of nowadays as a sort of cognitive scientific approach. What is contributed, for example, by the brain and the body, and what's contributed by the mind, and how do they work together? So I became more interested in not so much his dualism, which is certainly there at a metaphysical level, you can't deny it, but his natural philosophy and his theory of human nature is one that has this highly integrated functions of mind and body. And, to just bring us up to, my kind of current interests, along with Jackie Broad at Monash University and Marguerite Deslauriers at McGill University, our current project on early modern women and the foundation of thinking about equal rights in this very early modern period. Descartes is a major figure. Many of these early feminists, like Mary Astell, Pauline Delabarre, Sophia, and Mary Chudley, and so on, were inspired by Descartes because the emphasis on reason and will, and the account of generosity, which is a passion first and then a virtue, is account of virtue is very much an embodied sense of virtue. But it is focused around the use of reason and the will, and these women suddenly realised that the bodily differences did not make a difference to people's moral status, and so they used Cartesian philosophy to get feminism off the ground. And I think historically that's fascinating, and it's it's really fascinating to me to see how these women appropriated Cartesian philosophy for feminist ends. And we're talking here, you know, the second half of the 17th century, so way before first wave feminism by a country mile.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that Descartes has, it might be just a misperception with, and you'll know better than me, being close to the action, but it seems like, you know, you can name a number of very prominent historians of modern philosophy who are women who are also attracted to Descartes, apart from yourself, you know, like Margaret Wilson, for example, or my former colleague Amy Schmidt, as well. And
Lily Allenan is a
that goes on. So it's kind of interesting. It seems like there's actually something in that. This sits well with my realist sensibilities, that people are actually responding to real properties in the world, like even if part of the world there is a text. You know, and you go, yes, there's something in Descartes that opens up philosophical inquiry for all. I know that a lot of people have found like the cogito argument very empowering, and it opens their eyes to what's possible in philosophy and working things out from a foundational point of view or whatever as well. So there are different sorts of dimensions to that. I wanted to sort of finish up a little bit by coming to some of another aspect of your contemporary work. I know that together with Brian Key, you have this really interesting, relatively new, but not brand new project that takes you into topics like insect pain and plant sentience and you know, the minds of others that kind of touches on a little bit like that first session that we just had as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about that work?
Yes, so I found the first session fascinating because it is right up my alligator, as somebody might say. And you know, I think one of the things that we're doing. So first of all, I've teamed up with Brian Key, who's a neuroscientist. In fact, he's the head of the lab Brain Growth and Regeneration at the University of Queensland. And one of the things that we're questioning there is we're working on the.
Yeah, I'll leave it.
You want to get on chat?
We're working. Sorry. We're working on the animal consciousness debate, and we're particularly interested in arguments that are used in comparative neurobiology around consciousness. And a lot of those, you know, so the way that comparative, biology works is, comparative neurobiology works is that you start from, say, the human experience, because that's what, we can report. And, you then try to sort of uncover the neural structures that undergird that experience. And then you sort of, analogize out, right, to other species. So the way in which comparative neurobiology has worked with regard to, an area like pain, and pain is a really important place to start, an important area to start with, because of its importance, we know more about pain neurobiologically than we do any other kind of conscious experience. So that's why it becomes, like a kind of paradigm example of the kind of reasoning that we're interested in. When following that principle that structure determines function, right? So we've got pain, it's got a certain function in us, we can report on it, and we look at the structures that undergird that in the brain. And that work's been going on since the late 19th century with great physiologists like C.S. Sherrington and later his student Wilder Penfield and so on. So there's a long tradition of looking for those structures that undergird conscious experience. And we start looking out and we can see similar structures, similar cortical structures all the way down the mammalian chain. But it's what happens, at that changeover between mammals and other kinds of species, these sort of very peripheral cases like fish and cephalopods and so on, and insects. And more recently, there's been this debate about whether plants feel pain or plants have consciousness and so on. And there the structures are very different, right? And there's a widespread assumption within philosophy of mind that we have to accept that minds or consciousness are multiply realizable, that they could be realized in very different kinds of structures. And we let our thought experiments go wild, and we allow that there could be Martians, whose bodies are filled with green goop, who have conscious experiences of pain and so on. And we're really questioning that assumption. We see, multiple realizability happening at the micro level, and also at the macro level. But interestingly, there are just, many examples within comparative biology where, despite, morphological or micro level differences, you get a very common design structure. And so we're really sort of bringing that observation back into the discussion about pain and questioning whether we can, in fact, analogize out to things like insects and plants and so on, and to draw conclusions about their capacity to feel pain or not when we don't have that similarity of structure. And the other thing we think you have to kind of bear in mind is we have to be talking about the same thing, right? We can't just say, oh, pain is ambiguous, so pain in us looks different from pain in fish. We need to be able to keep the same sense of pain in play when we make those comparisons. Otherwise, we're just asking the question, we're just saying things like apples are like toasters, well, in some sense, yes, but in many senses, no.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so that's what that project's about. It's really looking at all of the arguments that get used in debates about animal consciousness.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, really, really interesting, close to lots of my own sorts of interests, but that's neither here nor there, I guess, more generally. But in that work, you're clearly engaged in a fairly deep interdisciplinary collaboration with people in a range of different sciences to do with the brain and the mind and so on. In your work in critical thinking, you're alluding to work in psychology and the psychology of education and learning, and you're partnering with educational institutions, organizations there. And it sounds like in the history of philosophy work as well, there's a respect for the actual history that's going on as well, and people from different historical epochs as well there. So it's really, it's a really broad series of interdisciplinary connections that you're making through the way in which you think about philosophy, and also connecting up with how philosophy gets done sort of in the real world and its impacts. So I found it really fascinating. I'm sure students have to have this kind of insight from you about your own pathway in philosophy, as well as some of these particular sorts of more detailed areas, and you're just like a font of knowledge there. Again, I draw students' attention to some of the connections. We'll repost them again later as well, because this will disappear soon. We've just got a question that's dropped in here, which I'll just read, and then we'll finish on that because we'll need to have a small break before the next session starts in 10 minutes. I'll just read it in case I don't know if you can see it in the chat, but for anyone else. It's fascinating to hear about your experience at UQ in the 80s and early 90s. Sounds like the model learning environment. Given how much education has changed since then, I wonder how you think we might better encourage young people who are intimidated by the rigor of philosophy's terminology and logic to take the subject, especially in the context of a competitive schooling environment where the easiest path to a higher ATAR, more marketable degree, is often seen as the priority. And that's from Tom Robertson, who's a facilitator from ACGS. Any quick 1 minute or 2 minute answer to that or response to that question?
Yes, not a quick one, but I'll try. I'll just keep it brief. Absolutely. So if you think about the difference between university and school, universities have, since their inception in the Middle Ages, been institution where essentially students come in, and what they have to do is they must learn how to make new contributions to knowledge. So if there's one thing that distinguishes university from schools, I think a lot of education schools, students are still expected to be knowledge consumers, right? To take extant knowledge and show they understand it and reproduce it back. But when they get to university, they're expected to be on the path to becoming a knowledge maker themselves, to be able to make new contributions to knowledge. And what we're really trying to do in the Critical Thinking Project is to help make that transition a little seamless, because there are so many students who have what's called culture shock. It's a sort of technical term in education literature, when they get to university and they suddenly realize it's not like school, only harder, that it's a very different game altogether. And I could show you, sort of assessment criteria from first semester, first year courses, which say, we're not interested in your capacity to recall. You have to be able to do all these things, critically question the textbook, come up with original insights, develop innovative questions and solutions to problems and so on. And students often freeze at that. So whatever they do in school that can help prepare them for that. And there's nothing better than philosophy and critical thinking for preparing students to make those new contributions to knowledge, because when they're engaged in philosophy and critical thinking, they're already engaged in the process of inquiry, right? They're asking those critical questions. They're developing new lines of inquiry. They're questioning the concepts. They're not taking things for granted. They're thinking about their own thinking and so on. They will hit the ground running when they hit university. So, I mean, our mission is that, we have to just make it imperative in schools that students get this kind of opportunity. Because otherwise, we're just not fulfilling our mission at university, and we're holding up so many other things as well. But great question.
Yeah, great. I see Tom nodding, so that sounds like a satisfactory 3-minute answer.
Ask me later.
If you're at least as tech savvy as we all have become in the last hour and a half, you can join me in thanking Deb by clicking the reaction button that gives a hand clap like this. Turn on your screens if you like to, and you can even do a little hand clap as we finish up this session. And I'll pass things back to Kaz.